Picture this. You've just given birth to 2 children, and you're now experiencing debilitating pain whenever you're on your period. Naturally, you decide to visit a doctor because you recognize that this is abnormal and it's inhibiting your ability to function properly. However, when you do receive medical attention, you're made to feel like the pain is all in your head. In fact, you're even prescribed antidepressants. In reality, you have a condition called endometriosis, and you won't receive a diagnosis until 15 years after your first appointment with a doctor. This is the story of a woman named Shirley who suffered for years before finally receiving validation that her pain is real. Medical misogyny, such as in the case of Shirley, is all too common. But what actually is it? The term medical misogyny refers to the systemic oppression of women in a medical setting or the healthcare industry. It can lead to things like the exclusion of women from research trials or the discrepancy between funding for female and male healthcare. We need to discuss how it has affected us, how it's still affecting us today, and what we can do about it. Medical misogyny has a long history across our society. All the way back in ancient Greece, the philosopher Hippocrates coined the word hysteria from the Greek word for uterus, hysteron. He said that hysteria was when a woman's uterus would move throughout her body when she wasn't fulfilling her role as a wife and mother. This diagnosis plagued women for centuries. In fact, it was still considered viable up into the 20th century. It was a way to justify institutionalizing women who didn't fit society's mold of what a woman should be. Unfortunately, medical misogyny has not just stopped there. It's also represented in the change in birthing positions. Nowadays, the most common position for women to give birth in is on their backs. However, historically, women gave birth while squatting or on a birthing stool. This allowed gravity to help with the natural process of labor, and it was often over much quicker. This all changed around the 17th century, when King Louis XIV was said to have liked watching his mistresses give birth, and having them sitting or squatting wasn't conducive to his viewing pleasure. So it is said that he asked his mistresses to give birth on their backs. This request spread across the entirety of Europe and later the entire globe, with women nowadays giving birth in a position that's not conducive to natural labor simply because a man asked them to. Medical misogyny still exists today, with the exclusion of women from clinical trials and research studies and psychiatric trials. For years, women were considered small men and weren't required to be included in clinical trials to test things like new medicine. In fact, in Canada, it took until 1997 for women to be required by law to be included in research studies. This has had deadly effects, particularly when women were using medications that were not tested on their bodies. For instance, in the cases of cisapride and zolpidem. Cisapride is a medication used to aid in heartburn. In Canada, 15-year-old Vanessa Young died of a heart attack associated with her use of cisapride. It turns out that cisapride wasn't properly tested on women, and it can have fatal results because of heart arrhythmias that it causes in female bodies. Had this medication been tested properly, Vanessa Young's death could have been avoided. A decade after the tragic passing of Young, Lindsay Schweigert awoke in the back of a police car, completely unsure of how she had arrived there. This was traced back to her use of the sleeping pill zolpidem, which, once again, was not tested on women. Later on, it was found that zolpidem metabolizes much slower in women than it does in men. So when women like Lindsay were using the prescribed dosage of the medication, they were actually consuming far too much. In the case of Schweigert, this meant that she slept walk all the way out to her car and was driving until police pulled her over. Medical misogyny also exists in the exclusion of women from research trials about different conditions, such as autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, which is a neurological condition characterized by difficulties with social interactions, hypersensitivity to sensory input, and hyperfixations. Currently, men are 4 times as likely to be diagnosed with ASD than women. This isn't necessarily because women are less likely to have autism, but more likely because they were never included in research trials about the condition, which means that their symptoms are completely unaccounted for within diagnostic criteria. This has led to the systemic misdiagnosis of women with autism, with many never receiving the supports they might have had they been diagnosed. Medical misogyny doesn't just stop with ASD. It also exists in the systemic mention of symptoms that affect men and not those that affect women. For instance, if I ask all of you what the most common symptom of a heart attack is, you'll probably say chest pain. In reality, this is a symptom that mainly affects men and not women. According to the University of Ottawa's Heart Institute, women commonly experience symptoms such as nausea, shortness of breath, and fatigue. However, since these symptoms aren't commonly associated with heart attacks, most women don't receive treatment for them to deadly results. Heart disease is the #1 killer of women over the age of 35 in Canada. This is not the case for men whose symptoms are more typical. However, are their symptoms more typical or simply more commonly discussed? Even when women do display symptoms of chest pain and go to seek medical attention, they report 29% longer wait times than men. This can be deadly for people in the critical stages of a heart attack. Medical misogyny affects something even more universal than heart attacks or ASD. It affects pain. Pain can manifest in a variety of conditions across various bodily systems. Women and girls make up the majority of people who suffer from chronic pain conditions such as fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, and irritable bowel syndrome. In addition, they're more likely to suffer from conditions such as endometriosis or vulvodynia because those are specific to them. Despite this, women's pain is often attributed to hormonal fluctuations or psychological factors. A study in the UK found that 50% of women felt dismissed when speaking to a medical professional about their symptoms. There were also horrifying reports of women being left to bleed for hours after a miscarriage while being made to feel like the pain was all in their head. Furthermore, the average wait time for a diagnosis of endometriosis, a chronic pain condition, is 9 years. In Australia, similar results were found, with 1 in 3 women feeling like their pain was completely dismissed. Pain is also dismissed during women's medical procedures, such as in the insertion of an IUD. According to CBC, most women that go for an IUD insertion, which is an intrauterine contraceptive device, were told that it would feel like just a pinch. And while this is the case for some women, far too many experience debilitating pain throughout the process. The process itself involves stabilizing the cervix using a pair of forceps, which often wind up removing part of the flesh when they come away. This, combined with the stretching of the cervix and the cramps due to a foreign device within the organ can lead to excruciating pain. There is no logical reason that most women should undergo this service with no offer of pain relief, and the only medical advice being to take an ibuprofen if necessary. All of these statistics are horrifying, and they're indicative of the deeply rooted patriarchal values within our society. But there is hope. Studies show that wait times for endometriosis diagnoses are steadily decreasing, and in the future, we might get to a point where medical misogyny is a thing of the past. But how do we reach that idyllic state? Well, there are a few things that we as a society can do. Firstly, we can introduce a discussion of medical misogyny to the medical school curriculum, particularly centered around chronic pain and diagnosis. This can help future healthcare professionals recognize the struggles that women go through when receiving medical attention. Secondly, we can work towards educating the general public. When people are aware of problems within our society, we can push towards change. It might also help a woman who is experiencing a chronic pain condition and feeling dismissed to push for a diagnosis if she recognizes that what might be happening to her is real and she's simply being ignored due to a systemic medical misogyny. Finally, we can increase funding for women's health care. In 2023, it was found that Canada only spent 6% of allocated healthcare funds on women's healthcare. If we work to level out this type of inequality, who knows what type of research can be done into conditions that have little to no research done about them already, such as endometriosis. All of these facts are things that we should push towards as a society. From the historical misuse of medicine to control women, to modern day exclusion from clinical trials, dismissed pain, and exclusion from research studies, it is clear that women have been and continue to be oppressed by medical systems worldwide. But we as a society need to push towards physicians listening instead of dismissing. We should trust women's pain and their experiences. Until we do this, our medical system fails everybody, because when it fails to serve half of our population, it does not fulfill its duty for anyone. Thank you.